Well, let us turn in our Bibles to Paul's first letter to the Corinthians in chapter 10. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians and chapter 10. The experts tell us that repetition is a sign of old age. Did you hear that? Repetition is a sign of old age. And so according to the experts, the fact that I've just repeated it would suggest that I'm not as young as I used to be. And that's not the only reason I know that. But then old age is not the only reason for repetition. It can also be an indication that something is very important and therefore worth mentioning again. And as we come to 1 Corinthians 10, verse 23, I think we ought to assume the latter reason for the repetition rather than the old age one. I say that because the phrase, you'll see it there in verse 23, the phrase "everything is permissible" is not only repeated within this verse, it was also repeated back in chapter 6, verse 12. And so that's 4 times Paul uses the phrase "everything is permissible." And the NIV is probably correct in portraying it as a quotation each time, because it may well have been a commonly used slogan by a section of the Corinthian congregation. These were people who claimed that their understanding of the Christian gospel, or their knowledge, as Paul calls it in chapter 8, verse 1, they assumed that that allowed them to go places and to do things which other Christians perhaps had serious reservations about. And in one sense, they were correct, in that the Christian gospel does bring us into a tremendous freedom. The problem was that they had a distorted view of Christian freedom, as we saw in the second half of chapter 6. And now that we have reached the closing section of chapter 10, we hear Paul addressing their slogan or their mantra once again. And as he does so, we'll hear him say a number of things about the whole subject of Christian freedom or Christian liberty. And just in case you are not exactly sure or clear what we mean by Christian liberty, let me illustrate it with the diagram on the screen. Can you see that? When deciding whether we ought to do something or not as a Christian, there are a few questions we ought to ask. And the obvious one, and the first one, is, does the Bible allow it? That is your first port of call, the Bible. And if the Bible doesn't allow it, then don't do it. The conversation stops there. There's nothing more to say. You just don't do it as a matter of obedience. If the Bible does allow it, then the next question you need to ask is, does your conscience allow it? And if the answer to that question is no, then don't do it. Because Paul teaches us, and especially in Romans 14 and 15, that we shouldn't go against our conscience. But if the Bible allows it, and your conscience allows it, then that brings you into an area of Christian freedom, Christian liberty, with respect to that thing. If the answer to both of those questions is yes, then we might automatically assume that we're free to go ahead and do that thing. And in one sense, we are free to do it. A yes to both of those questions brings us into an area of Christian freedom or Christian liberty on that particular issue. But what Paul has been teaching us in chapters 8 to 10 is that even in our Christian freedom, there are some other questions we ought to ask. And there are some other factors that we ought to take into account. before we decide to go ahead or not. That is what we call Christian liberty, Christian freedom. And in this closing section of chapter 10, we'll hear him summarise a few things concerning that. The first being in verses 23 and 24. And there we have an important principle of Christian liberty. An important principle of Christian liberty. Now, if you compare the repetition of the slogan here in verse 23 with the one back in chapter 6, verse 12, you will see a very slight but significant difference. A difference that is indicated in both the NIV and the ESV, but not indicated by the Authorized Version. In chapter 6, verse 12, the quotation is, "Everything is permissible for me." Whereas here in chapter 10, verse 23, the quotation is simply, "Everything is permissible." In chapter 6, Paul was addressing what they thought was permissible for them as individual Christians, and he had to say back then that although something may be permissible for you to do as a Christian, it may not be beneficial for you as a Christian. Whereas here in chapters 8 to 10, he's been addressing the issue of our Christian liberty, not just in relation to me as an individual Christian, but also in relation to the other people around me. If you've been with us over recent weeks, then you'll know that there has been a big emphasis in chapters 8 and 9 on the restraining of our freedom or the relinquishing of our rights for the good of others. In chapter 8, verse 9, it was the relinquishing of our rights for the sake of our fellow Christian who has a weaker conscience. In chapter 9, verse 18, it was the relinquishing of our rights for the sake of the non-Christians around us who have never heard the gospel. And once again, there is the emphasis here in chapter 10 on exercising our freedom in a way that is for not just my good, but in a way that is for the good of others. Did you notice what Paul says in verse 24? Nobody should seek his own good, but the good of others. And it is perhaps best to see that principle in verse 24 as controlling what is said in verse 23. And so when Paul says in verse 23, everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial, he probably means that although something may strictly speaking be okay for me to do, it may not be helpful or beneficial to others around me. Likewise, although everything is permissible for us to do, not everything that is permissible is necessarily helpful or constructive to those around us. There was a 17th century poet called John Donne, and one of his famous poems had the title, "No Man is an Island." No man is an island. It's a reminder that nobody lives in complete isolation from everybody else. Our lives are to some extent interconnected to the people around us. That is true even in a rampantly individualistic society like ours. And if you are a Christian this morning, then it ought to be true of you to an even greater extent. I say that because regardless of our culture, our individualistic culture, regardless of our culture, it was never God's intention that his people live isolated, independent lives. He always intended them to live out their lives as the people of God within a believing community. That was true in Old Testament times. It was true in New Testament times, and it continues to be true today. As a Christian, you certainly should never see yourself as an isolated island passing through this world, but rather as someone who is interconnected and interrelated and interdependent on your fellow Christians, primarily within the context of your local church. And as we'll see a little later in the passage, because of our responsibility and our desire to share the gospel, our lives ought also not only to be interconnected to some extent with the believing people around us, they ought also to be interconnected to some extent with the unbelieving people around us as well. And it is with respect to both the believing and unbelieving people around us that Paul says in verse 24, nobody should seek his own good, but the good of others. And so, in deciding what I should and should not do, you remember the chart? Does the Bible allow it? No? Well, forget it. But if yes, does my conscience allow it? No? Forget it. But if yes, in deciding what I should and should not do, I shouldn't just be thinking of what the consequences of my actions will be for me personally. I should also take into account what the implications of my actions will be for those around me. Will my actions be helpful and beneficial and constructive to my fellow Christians, some of whom may have a weaker conscience than I have? Will it be helpful to them, beneficial to them? If not, then I should seriously think again about doing that thing, because verse 24, nobody should seek his own good, but the good of others. Will my actions be helpful and beneficial and constructive to the unbelievers around me, who have perhaps never heard the gospel, or if they have, they're struggling to understand and appreciate the significance of it? Will it be helpful and beneficial to them? If not, then I should seriously think again about doing that thing, because verse 24, nobody should seek his own good, but the good of others. Seeking the good of others rather than simply our own personal benefit is an important principle to remember when exercising our Christian liberty. Secondly, verses 25 and 26, and there we see an example of Christian liberty. An example of Christian liberty. Now, if you've been with us over recent weeks, then you may remember that Paul's teaching on Christian freedom and liberty, it hasn't been given in a dry, abstract, academic manner. No, far from it. It's been taught within the context of what was a very live and real and big issue for these first century Christians in Corinth, and that was the eating of food which had previously been offered to an idol. As I said on previous occasions, idolatry was so prevalent in first century Corinth that some, or perhaps most of the meat that was served in the restaurants or was sold in the supermarkets had at some point in its history been associated with a temple or a shrine or a religious guru of some description. And the question for these Christians was whether it was okay to eat such meat. Well, can I remind you of an important distinction that Paul has already made on the subject? In chapter 10, verses 18 to 22, he was referring to food which was currently being offered to an idol, which meant that those verses were about actually participating in the idol feast and therefore participating in the idol worship. And that, says Paul, was simply not on for a Christian, because chapter 10, verse 20, such sacrifices are offered to demons, and you mustn't participate with demons. In chapter 8, however, if you can remember that far back, Paul was referring to food which had previously been offered to an idol at some point in the past. And although he said in chapter 8, verse 9, that we should not exercise our freedom in the eating of such food if there was the risk of it being a stumbling block to a fellow Christian, the clear implication was that in principle, it was something that we were free to do. And it is a similar expression of Christian freedom that Paul teaches in chapter 10, verse 25, when he says, eat anything sold in the meat market without raising questions of conscience. In other words, says Paul, when you do your weekly shop, and you can picture what that was like in Corinth. When you do your weekly shop, you're going round with a trolley. You don't need to be paranoid about where the food has come from or what its history is. You don't need to be paranoid about that. You can freely buy and freely eat whatever is on sale. When I say freely, you still have to pay for it, but you know what I mean. You can freely buy and freely, without even asking questions of a conscience nature. For the simple reason, verse 26, for the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. That's why we read Psalm 24 at the start. This is a quotation from the opening verse of Psalm 24, where David says that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it, or because this is why it is the Lord's, for he founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters. In other words, says David, because it is God who created this world and everything in it, he is its rightful owner. The earth is the Lord's. He is its rightful owner and everything in it. And therefore the food on your supermarket shelf is his and has come to us from him. Oh, a religious guru may have prayed over it at some point in the past, but that does not mean that it now belongs to his God. No. The earth is the Lord's. Your God and my God. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. And therefore, regardless of what some priest may have said in the past, the food on the supermarket shelf is the Lord's. And therefore, you ought to receive it as having come from him. Now, just in case I'm misunderstood, that is not to say that everything that is for sale on the supermarket shelf today is equally healthy or necessarily good for you, especially in an age when so much of our meat is processed meat and so much of our food has been chemically altered or manufactured and all the rest of it. And so please don't think that these two verses in 1 Corinthians 10 allow you to ignore whatever advice your doctor has given you regarding your diet. Paul is not speaking as a dietitian. He's not speaking as someone whose primary concern is carbs or calories, proteins or vitamins, and so please don't interpret his words in that way. But what he is saying is that from a religious point of view, you and I are free to eat whatever meat is on sale at the supermarket. That is an example of our Christian liberty. And it applies not only to the meat that we buy, but it also applies to many aspects of our lives as well. Yes, we live in a world that has been blighted by sin in every respect. That is true. As a result of what happened in Genesis 3, we live in a world that is far from perfect, far from what God originally created it to be. It's been tainted and blighted by sin in every respect. But at the same time, we have to remember that even post-Genesis 3, the earth and everything in it still belongs to the Lord. The serpent may have deceived Adam and Eve in the garden, but the earth doesn't belong to the serpent now. He may be active, going around like a roving lion looking for someone to devour, but this world doesn't belong to him. It belongs to your God. The earth is the Lord's. It still belongs to the Lord. It is he who created and continues to sustain it. And as Paul tells us in 1 Timothy 6, verse 17, all the good things that we enjoy in this world, they have been given to us by God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. And so, although there are some things which the Christian should not and cannot do, as we discovered in verses 18 to 22, although that is true, there are many other things, physical, material, cultural, natural. There are many other things which the Christian is free to do and can enjoy and do, because they are some of the blessings of living in a world that has been so wonderfully created and has been so wisely governed by our good and great and glorious God. Those are examples of our Christian liberty, and we need to protect them. Thirdly, verses 27 to 30, an example of a Christian restraining their liberty. An example of a Christian restraining their liberty. Now, having told us what to do in the supermarket, Paul now tells us what to do in the home of your unbelieving neighbour or unbelieving friend. Because as you can appreciate, it's one thing to walk the aisles of a supermarket and decide what to eat, what not to eat. That's fairly easy to do. But it's another thing to be invited in to your friend's house or your neighbour's house for a meal, and there have to decide what to eat or what not to eat. It's different because this time there's personal relationships involved. And please note, Paul assumes that we will have such relationships with the unbelieving people around us. Did you notice that? He thought it was perfectly feasible that your unbelieving neighbour or work colleague might invite you in for a meal. Verse 27. If some unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go, eat whatever is put before you without raising questions of conscience. And so, as in the case of the supermarket, you don't need to ask your neighbour a whole list of questions about the origins or the religious history of the food, or this or that. Yes, if you've got some dietary requirements, you might want to ask a question or two, but that's by the way. But as a Christian, you don't need to ask all those sort of questions about, has this got a religious history to it? You can just get on and eat it and enjoy it with a clear conscience. That's Christian liberty. But, verse 28, if anyone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, both for the sake of the man who told you and for conscience sake, the other man's conscience, I mean, not yours. Now, it's probably fair to assume that the person who makes this announcement, and if you disagree with this assumption, then you can discuss it on Tuesday night. But I assume that the person who makes this announcement about the religious history of the food is the unbelieving host who has invited you and who has served it up. Why he makes the announcement, we do not know, but he does. If he does, then it's better not to eat. It's better not to eat for his sake. For his conscience sake. Did you notice that at the beginning of verse 29? The reason for declining the food is not because of your conscience. No. Your conscience would be perfectly clear in eating such a meal, just as it was perfectly clear in buying from the supermarket. But it is your unbelieving friend's conscience you have to think about. The fact that he has raised the matter would suggest that he thinks it's important that you are aware of it. It is he who is in danger of feeling bad about it. It is he who is in danger of having a guilty conscience about you eating it. Well, why he served it up for you in the first place, if he feels like that, is not entirely clear. And that's something else you might want to discuss on Tuesday night. But he has served it up. And now thinks it's important that you're aware of that. And so for his sake, says Paul, and for his conscience sake, you refrain from eating that particular dish. Well, hopefully there will be other dishes you can eat from, but not that one. Out of a concern for your unbelieving friend, you refrain from tucking into that mouth-watering dish in the middle of the table. That is an example of a Christian restraining their liberty for the good of others. And it is an example that raises some interesting questions, as Paul goes on to ask in verses 29 and 30. Questions such as, why should my freedom be judged by another's conscience? Or as the ESV says, why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? And as we've worked our way through chapters 8, 9 and 10, that is perhaps a question that's been at your mind. If I take part in the meal with thanksgiving, says Paul, why am I denounced because of something I thank God for? In other words, says Paul, why should that other person's qualms or scruples about my actions regulate what I can and cannot do? And he's raising those questions to make sure that we've understood the issue that has been at stake throughout chapters 8 to 10. And that is our willingness to take others into account as we exercise our Christian liberty. The issue throughout these 3 chapters has been our willingness to rein in, or even relinquish, if need be, our freedoms, our liberties, and our rights for the sake of others. As he said back in verse 24, nobody should seek his own good. In this matter of Christian liberty, nobody should seek his own good, but rather the good of others. And that continues to be an enormous challenge for us, as it was for the Christians in Corinth, because to use John Donne's language, we so often act and behave as if we were little independent, autonomous islands. Do we not? Especially when it comes to our Christian liberty. That is our culture's attitude to rights and freedoms. If you want to do it, if you think it's right, get on with it, regardless of what others might think, regardless of what effect it might have on anybody else. That is our culture's attitude to freedoms and liberties and rights. And sadly, we as Christians can so easily imbibe it, believing that something is okay for me to do. We so often proceed to doing it without giving anyone else a moment's thought. We do so because we believe that the exercising of our freedom is our right. And in one sense it is. But the whole point of these 3 chapters is that there are times when we ought to consider relinquishing our rights for the sake of others, for the sake of other Christians, as we saw in chapter 8, for the sake of the gospel, as we saw in chapter 9, and now for the sake of the unbeliever that we have personal contact with, as we now see in chapter 10. What we have in verses 27 to 30 of chapter 10 is an example of a Christian restraining their liberty. Because don't forget, and here is an important thing, don't forget that true Christian freedom is not only a freedom to do something, it is also a freedom not to do that particular thing. As Paul pointed out back in chapter 6, if I am no longer able to refrain from exercising my freedom on a particular matter, then I have effectively lost my freedom on that matter because it has mastered me. Mastered me. in doing the very thing I think I'm free in doing, if I can no longer say no to that thing, then I've lost my freedom because it has mastered me. And therefore, far from being a sign of weakness, the Christian who is able and prepared not to do for the sake of others what they consider they are free to do is the Christian who has truly understood their freedom in Christ. Which, as we've seen in verses 27 to 30 of chapter 10, is a freedom to say no. It's a freedom to refrain on occasions. Fourthly and finally, verse 31 through to the opening verse of chapter 11, and there we have the all-important criteria in the exercising of our Christian liberty. Now, as Paul brings his discussion on Christian liberty to a conclusion, he provides us with some big general principles, and the first of those is verse 31. So, whatever you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Now, the reference to eating and drinking obviously has particular relevance within the context of these chapters. But did you notice that Paul doesn't restrict his principle to the issue of eating and drinking? Just in case you read these 3 chapters and you think, well, I don't really mix with people who participate in idol feasts, and so I don't really see the relevance of all of this to me. Well, here is the relevance, because Paul adds these words: not only eating and drinking, whatever you do. And he adds those words to encompass the whole of our lives. The whole of our lives. This is one of the many verses in the Bible that challenges those sacred secular divides that we so often construct as Christian people in life. It's totally unbiblical. All of life, says Paul, all of life. Regardless of what day of the week it is, regardless of what areas of our lives it may be, regardless of whether it be the private or more public aspects of our lives, all of our lives is to be lived for the glory of God. And within the context of this chapter, it must surely include the exercising of our Christian liberty. That too must be done for the glory of God. And so as we come to decide whether or not to do a particular thing, it's not enough just to ask whether it is okay to do that thing. And neither is it enough just to ask if there's anything wrong with doing that particular thing. It's interesting, we always ask, is there anything wrong with it? We never ask what's right about it. But yes, to ask, is there anything wrong with doing that thing? Yes, that is a question we obviously need to ask. But in addition to asking that one, we ought to ask a few other questions, and amongst them is this question: will it bring glory to God? Will it bring glory to God? And I would suggest that in the following 3 verses, Paul provides us with 2 criteria which will help us decide whether the exercising of our Christian liberty in a particular way is going to be glorifying to God. The first is expressed negatively, the second positively. The first question we need to ask is verse 32. Will the exercising of my freedom cause others to stumble? Verse 32. Do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, Greeks, or the Church of God. Now, the reference to Jews and Greeks is a reference to the unbelieving people around us, while the reference to the Church of God is a reference to believing people. And so what Paul is saying is this: don't exercise your Christian liberty in a way that causes either the believers or the unbelievers around you to stumble. If you do, then it won't be for the glory of God. Yes, strictly speaking, that thing you're going to thinking of doing, strictly speaking, that might be okay. The Bible might not forbid it. It might be okay, and your conscience might say it's okay. But if it's going to cause other people to stumble, whether they be believers or unbelievers, if it's going to cause others to stumble, then it won't be for the glory of God. Secondly, verse 33, chapter 11, verse 1, does my exercising of my Christian liberty, does it follow the example of Paul? And more importantly, does it follow the example of Christ? Having said in verse 32 that we should not cause anyone to stumble, Paul goes on to explain how he himself has sought to implement that principle within his own life. Even as I try to please everybody in every way, for I am not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. He's repeating what he said back in chapter 9, verse 22, you may remember. I've become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. He's practicing what he preached in chapter 10, verse 24, when he said nobody should seek his own good, but the good of others. The spiritual and eternal good of others was the big criteria in how Paul exercised his Christian liberty. And in the opening verse of chapter 11, he tells us to follow his example. We are to follow his apostolic example in the exercising of our Christian liberty, not only because it's a good example to follow, but also, and especially, because in following his example, we will be following the example of someone else, and that is our Lord Jesus Christ. Do you remember how he exercised his freedom? Oh yes, he had liberty too, don't forget. More than you and I will ever have. Do you remember how he exercised his freedom, his liberty, his rights? Don't ever forget it. We sang about it in that hymn a few minutes ago. Although being in very nature God, he did not consider equality with God something to be clung on to at all costs. Rather than enjoying the splendor of heaven, which was his eternal right, rather than clinging on to that right, what did he do? He relinquished it. He left the splendor of heaven. He came into this world. He made himself nothing. He took the very nature of a servant. He humbled himself, all the time relinquishing his rights. He humbled himself and even became obedient to death. And that the death of a cross. That was the willingness of Jesus to relinquish his rights, to relinquish his freedoms. Imagine the one who, as we sung about, he spoke and the universe came into being. And yet he takes the very nature of a servant. That was his willingness to relinquish his rights and his freedoms for the spiritual and eternal good of others. And don't forget, if he hadn't been willing to do so, you and I would have been eternally damned. But praise God, he was willing to relinquish his rights. And that, says Paul, is the pattern I seek to follow in the exercising of my rights and my freedoms. And just as I follow the example of Christ, so should you follow my example, says Paul, exercising your Christian freedom for the spiritual and eternal good of others, rather than for your own selfish, self-centered benefit. There is in that way that the exercising of our freedom will make us more like Christ, and therefore will be for the glory of God. And that, don't forget, is the all-important criteria in the exercising of our Christian liberty? Is it for the glory of God? And so in closing, as we bring these three chapters to an end, let me remind you from the diagram of a few other questions we ought to ask when deciding whether we ought to do or not do something. Firstly, does the Bible allow it? No, forget it. Does the Bible allow it? Yes. Does your conscience allow it? No, then don't do it. But if your conscience allows it, then you're into an area of Christian freedom and Christian liberty. But there are some other questions you need to ask. 3 further questions. What is the effect of this going to be on other Christians? That was chapter 8, where we learnt that love is more important than knowledge. Secondly, what is the effect of this going to be on non-Christians? Chapter 9, and a little bit today, where we learnt that the gospel is more important than rights. And thirdly, what is the effect of this going to be on my likeness to Christ? Because don't forget, that and the glory of God that results from that, that is the all-important